And who is this person? Well, it's probably not a secret to you. It's this man standing here, Krycho, who is going to be delivering our opening keynote on open source software and how the way we're approaching open source software as commons is actually totally wrong and might be threatening our industry. And I think you're going to see some very thought-provoking ideas for both the fact that there is a problem here, as well as what are some of the ways we might be able to address this going forward. A fun fact about Chris is that I don't know where he gets the time for this, given all of his hobbies and interests, but he is a composer of classical music. So please help me welcome to the stage Chris Krycho. Thank you.
Back in 2021, we had one of the worst security vulnerabilities that's ever hit our industry, the Log4 shell incident and the Log4j library. So what happened? Well, at a technical level, Log4j is a logging library, and it has actually been a fairly ingredient part of the Java ecosystem for literally decades, and it was reasonably designed to allow you to send your logs off to a remote server. Seems fine. But there was a flaw that meant that you could execute code on said remote server. So if you triggered a request in a particular way, you could run a shell script on an arbitrary machine. To put it mildly, this is very bad. What happened at a social level? Well, some folks at Alibaba discovered and reported this vulnerability to the folks who maintain Log4j, the Apache Logging Services team. And at some point, the information also got out to the rest of the world while the Apache Logging Services team was still working on fixing it. And so, infamously, one of the Alibaba engineers said to the maintainers, "Please hurry up." I think they meant well. This was a real vulnerability out in the world that was now exploitable because known, but not a great look. Meanwhile, the team, the Apache Logging Services team, confirmed, yep, this is a problem, we're going to fix it, and they did so. But the Apache Logging Services team, it's worth noting, was a team of 16 unpaid volunteers. And many of them worked nights and over a long weekend to fix this bug that had been reported to them. Hurry up. And they did it for professional pride. They were unpaid. This was not their job, but they did it because they knew it was the right thing to do. And then once the fix was out, the rest of the ecosystem scrambled to patch everything. Google estimated that about 8% of packages on Maven, so that's a lot of packages, were affected by this. So to get this all patched in your app, you needed to make sure that all of the dependencies that you used were also patched. It took weeks, in some cases months, for everybody to be able to be fully patched. And the sad truth is there's probably some unpatched code still running out there, but mostly it's fixed. Great. What this shows us is that Log4j is a digital kind of infrastructure. It is, therefore, a common good. We're going to unpack all of this over the rest of the talk. But Log4j was built and maintained by unfunded volunteers, and that's changed a little since 2021. We'll come back to that, for this project in particular, but not so much for lots of other load-bearing projects. And load-bearing is the right phrase here, because increasingly, open source software is infrastructure for our world. But open source software is not like other infrastructure. It's weird infrastructure. So if we're going to make it work for us as infrastructure, we need to understand, one, how infrastructure works normally, and two, how open source actually works, so that then we can see, okay, how is open source weird? And use that to chart a path forward to make open source work for us as infrastructure. So let's start here. What is infrastructure? When you think of infrastructure, you probably think of transport, maybe, bridges, canals, roads. You might think of freight, Trains, boats, aircrafts, yes, the occasional horse-drawn wagon is still involved. You might be thinking of power plants and electrical stations and plumbing and sewage and water treatment plants and increasingly the computing that makes all of those happen. If you think about what a common thread between all of those kinds of things might be, though, it's that they're largely out of sight and out of mind, at least until something goes wrong. In her excellent book, How Infrastructure Works, which we're going to come back to regularly throughout the talk, Deb Chatra suggests that this is actually almost a definition for infrastructure. What makes infrastructure infrastructure, she asks? All of the stuff that you don't think about turns out to be a surprisingly good starting point. For something to be considered infrastructure, its presence and characteristics are taken as a given. Taken as a given is a pretty good description of how we thought about Log4j until that vulnerability report. And it's how we think about most open source software. Consider, the internet doesn't just run on open source protocols, it runs on open source software. Almost all web traffic goes through open source web frameworks sitting on top of open source libraries and tools and all the way down to the operating system. React, Django, Java, Nginx, Linux, the whole thing, the whole stack. So if there's a critical vulnerability or bug in any of that, or in the tools that come along with them, like XZ a couple years ago, it can ground airlines, it can bring down the power grid, it can cost businesses a literal fortune. Most importantly, from my point of view, it costs people their money, their time, and in the worst cases, power grid goes down and the hospital's in a bad spot, it can cost people their lives. Now, those are the extreme cases, but this is actually everywhere. Software acting as infrastructure, and specifically open source. So when I wrote this talk, I did it in an app called Ulysses, running on my Mac, and I'm presenting it in KEYNOTE on my Mac. And large chunks of those were built in languages and frameworks that are open source. Swift is a 100% open source language. Objective-C is not, but both of them are built with Clang and LLVM, open source compiler infrastructure. And they're running on macOS, which that's closed source, but it's running on Darwin, which is open source. And that's sitting on top of Darwin and XGNU and Mach, which are open source and decades old. And these things were not built like normal infrastructure was. Let's look at LLVM and Clang for a second. So these were eventually built by Apple, yes, but they also have contributions from indie devs working on their own bespoke programming languages, and also from Google, which is a huge competitor to Apple. And this contribution pattern is extremely common in open source software. It's so common that we take it for granted. Of course, these huge competitors who seem to hate each other's guts collaborate on key infrastructure. What? No, this is actually very strange if we take a step back. In particular, it's a strange way to build infrastructure because it wasn't funded like normal infrastructure. The city of Sunnyvale didn't say, we need a competitor to GCC in the compiler tooling space. But it also wasn't funded by normal market mechanisms. You can't buy a license to Clang. You get it for free. You can't pay for LLVM. It's free. That's not how we build normal infrastructure. And yes, there are some open source projects where you do have to pay, but this is the norm, and that's weird. So let's talk a little about how the sausage gets made. How does open source actually work? Who makes it? Why do they make it? Do they get paid for it? Spoilers, mostly no. Who makes it? Well, this ranges from literally, I sat down and wrote a library with one of my good friends back in 2017 because we saw a problem and decided to fix it. Cool. To, well, we just saw mega corporations, foundations, large groups of contributors. I've contributed also to projects that have dozens of core teams and hundreds, maybe thousands of contributors and everything in between. What about why? Why do we do this? Well, one reason is just interest, passion, fun. I want to learn something. I want to learn something by doing something and then put it out there for people to share. Another is fixing a bug in that stack of things that my company uses, as we all basically do, and then pushing that back out into the world because we recognize that as something kind of infrastructural, if we don't share it, what are we doing here? We're getting that benefit and not giving it. The whole reason it works is because we all coordinate on this shared solution. Even sharing a solution that my company came up with to a common problem so that other people can benefit, which again, in a hyper-competitive market situation is a little unusual. It's a little strange. Theoretically, profit might also be on the list, but the number of people actually feeding and clothing and housing their families through open source is a pretty short list. Which gets us to this last point. Do they get paid for it? And the answer again is mostly no, but increasingly over time, some large and important projects do have funding headed their way. Maybe it's a small thing, GitHub sponsors or Open Collective, or maybe it's actual corporate funding. Companies paying people, their own employees, to work on a project they depend on, or to build an open source project entirely because they think it will benefit them in some way. We'll come back to that. Or paying the maintainers of something they depend on because they recognize it's important. Let's dig in there a little bit. Companies do actually produce lots of open source software. And they do this both sometimes as kind of their main product and sometimes not. So in the areas where it's not the main product, the first of these that came to mind as I was thinking about this is the let's commoditize a complement. That is, we have some part of our code that is not key to how we make money, but it's key to how some other company we see ourselves in competition with makes money. Okay, let's open source our version of that, because then it's really hard for them to sell it. Might not be impossible, but it's a lot harder, and we like that. Let's hurt our competitor. Another variation here is it's just part of the funnel. So maybe I have some open source library, and I sell hosted infrastructure. And yeah, you can use that library anywhere with some work. But it runs really well on our infrastructure. Wouldn't you like to come use our infrastructure? It's just part of the funnel. And there are good ways to do that and bad ways to do that. But you know, the open source in this view isn't the product, it's the hook. Come check out our product. On the flip side, where open source is notionally the main product, we have things like dual licensing or other schemes where you do actually need to pay for the open source. Open core, where it's got a proprietary wrapper around it, or hey, it's free for small businesses and students, but if you've got over $1 million of revenue, please contact our enterprise licensing team. I hate seeing that on a website. No, just tell me the price, come on. But in this case, the main product is usually the software itself. And the other one where we think of it as the main product is selling support. Think of this as the Red Hat model. Red Hat ships a lot of open source software, but what they actually are selling is support. And none of these, notice, are particularly bad models for selling software per se. They might be a little more hostile, commoditizing a complement, but they're reasonable competitive models. But what they aren't is very good fits for infrastructure. The first two are too much in the competitive rather than cooperative space, and the latter two still centralize points of failure, and they also, well, they don't really fit how we think about infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to log4j for a second. Let's think about what I call the infrastructure assumption. Most companies who adopted log4j adopted it the way that you and I adopted the roads we took when we drove here. We didn't think, what's the maintenance story for this highway? We just assumed it's infrastructure. It just works, out of sight and out of mind. And if it doesn't, well, that's somebody's job to fix it. And this is one of the major challenges for all infrastructure. So here's Deb Chatra again. Infrastructural systems are famously boring because the best possible outcome is nothing happening, or at least nothing unexpected or untoward. Boring. That's what we expect of log4j. Nothing happens, or nothing unexpected. But it also, this assumption carries along the expectation that someone is responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of these things. That someone's on the hook if they go wrong. After all, if one of the bridges was out on the way up here, somebody would be working on that. And that's generally true for physical world infrastructure. But it's not true of open source software for a couple reasons. The first is the standard no warranty clause. And I call it standard for a reason, because the no warranty clause in software licenses has been there from basically day one. You cannot find an open source type license that doesn't have this. This seems to have been because the authors recognized that starting with the adoption of the uniform commercial, it's hard to say those words together, Uniform Commercial Code in 1951, the legal environment in the United States said, if you don't say there's no warranty, you imply there's a warranty. And so the author of early software said, we don't know what we're doing here, let's not. And so they said, no warranties. And here we are, 70 years later, saying no warranties. So any company that's using open source software has explicitly legally agreed, yeah, we will not hold you responsible. We waive all responsibility. We don't expect this to be bug-free. Great. Legally, that's true. But the infrastructure assumption means that socially, we don't act like that's true. Please hurry up. You might be able to say, look, you can't hold me liable from a legal point of view, but professional pride and social pressure change that dynamic a lot. And that's because of the second part of the problem, which is that we don't actually have a good way of expressing shared responsibility for open source as infrastructure. There's a perceived responsibility on the authors, but in practice, the authors of a package like log4j have no idea who's using their code. You just clone it and use it. Check it out from Maven, move on, great. It's infinitely reproducible. Moreover, they have, as we've seen, no legal relationship with those users other than the disclaimer of warranty. And broadly speaking, no financial relationship with those users either. This looks nothing like normal infrastructure building. So you might be inclined to respond by saying, okay, so then the answer is fix it yourself. If you're Alibaba, if you're Google, great. But I said this earlier, that undercuts why we use open source software. It's because it has that nice infrastructure-like property of saying, no, we have a shared common solution to this problem, and everybody gets to benefit from it. If that weren't the case, we'd all just go build our own versions of everything. Okay, so maybe the solution is to build legal and financial relationships with maintainers. It's not a bad idea, but, well, it's complicated. Doing it on the fly is hard. So when log4 shell happens, you're trying to figure it out then? But for another, it comes with a whole bucket of coordination problems. How much is a fix to log4j worth? Is it the total cost of possible losses? I don't know. And which companies are responsible to pay it? Is it every company that uses log4j? Maybe? Okay, but then how much does each of those pay? Like, do Google and Alibaba have to now pay some amount of the potential losses? Their total revenue? And that's going to those 16, on the one hand, it's weird that it's 16 unfunded volunteers. On the other hand, if we said it's like 10% of Google's revenue to those 16 volunteers, that also seems weird. Finally, let's say we figured out those complicated first three. Who's going to collect and distribute the funds? The problem is that the users of a project like log4j, mostly implicitly, but actually think of it as infrastructure. They just assume it works like infrastructure because it mostly does in practice, which is remarkable. But because of the ways we build it, the authors of a project like log4j get none of the support that we offer to real-world infrastructure, even with the caveat that we often underfund real-world infrastructure. I'm going to take a little sidestep here and talk about value, because when we get into this discussion in the broader community around open source, we often get distracted thinking about value and the value chains that open source offers. And it's really easy to get derailed thinking about the fact that big businesses capture more value from open source than they put back into it. But I will argue that it is not necessarily unjust that that happens. Necessarily is an important word there. More than that, it actually shouldn't surprise us that that's the case because, as we said earlier, infrastructure is a common good, but it's also a public good. And I don't mean that in a hand-wavy way. I mean it in a very precise kind of, how does economics teach us to think about public good? So here's Deb Chatra again. Great book, recommend it. Public good has a very specific and distinct meaning. In contrast to a private good, a public good is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Non-rivalrous means that one person having access to or enjoying a good does not preclude other people from doing the same. Non-excludable means that people can't be prevented from using and benefiting from it. She continues, private goods have an obvious business model. Make the thing, sell the thing. There's generally much less incentive for the private sector to produce non-excludable goods, because if you can't prevent people from receiving a benefit and they no longer have a reason to pay for it, they presumably won't. The free rider problem. Too many free riders and too few paying customers means that the provider won't be able to make a profit if their business model is based on selling access to that benefit. Or, in the case of open source, I just described the burnout problem. Now, this is not to say that people don't deserve to be paid for their labors on infrastructure. Obviously, they do. And there is something a little bit off in the way that giant corporations sometimes benefit enormously from open source without contributing back to its funding. But if we pause there, we might note that even open source software, even mega corporations contribute enormous amounts to open source software in ways that don't redound directly to their bottom line. And yeah, you might be able to come up with ways that, well, that still benefits them. But the actual reason they do it, I think, is because at the end of the day, infrastructure is something we all benefit from. What's more, as Chatra points out, when we get into that model for infrastructure, infrastructural systems by their nature are more than just technical. They are inextricably social and political because they're intrinsically collective. Because they incorporate non-monetary externalities, both positive and negative, they can't easily be valued or assessed like a consumer good, where it's quote-unquote worth it to buy something or not. So they don't lend themselves to decision-making that focuses solely on the costs or the returns on investment. I'll go further. When we say that open source software generates more value than it captures, or if we invert that about how people capture value from it that they don't put back, we've already adopted a very specific worldview, because value captured and value generated are not value-neutral terms. They represent a specific market-oriented way of thinking about things. And markets aren't bad, I like them, but this can become a problem when it devolves into what writer and thinker Alan Jacobs calls metaphysical capitalism. That is, the reduction of all acts, the reconception of all acts in market terms. And again, you don't have to be down on markets or capitalism to think that not everything should be framed that way. We shouldn't think of our friendships or our marriages in terms of value captured and value generated. That's perverse. So what is striking to me, what is distinctive to me about open source software is actually not the fact that it creates more value than it captures. That actually just means that it's infrastructure. That's how infrastructure works. No, what's distinctive is how it does that, with a minimum of explicit coordination, often no explicit coordination. And that happens sometimes even within a project level, but it especially happens between projects. I can put out that library and someone else can put out another library, and neither of us ever talk to each other, and other people build on top of them. And that's how all of open source works. Second, without public funding, usually without any funding. Third, how the free rider problem shows up. Chatra mentioned that earlier, and I want to dig in on it because, well, open source software is by nature, and I use that word carefully and intentionally, a common good, because it's by definition non-rivalrous. As I said, you get a copy of Log4j and I get a copy of Log4j, and what does that matter to the authors? We'll see how it matters in a moment, but the software itself is non-rivalrous. It's infinitely replicable at no marginal cost. And it's also by default non-excludable. We have to come up with ways to impose costs on the use of software. It makes sense if I'm hosting infrastructure, but otherwise to get you to pay me for it, the reason that piracy is common in software is because that's the natural state of software. And that's not how we should leave it, but that is the natural state. It's easy for you to just get a copy and use it. And in the case of open source software, well, it's free. We've encouraged you to use it that way. But where open source software is by nature a common good, and let's note for a moment how remarkable that is, the same is not true. In fact, exactly the inverse is true of people's time. People's time is not a common good. It is, in some sense, completely rivalrous, completely excludable. Our time, in a very real sense, is our life. And so treating people's time as a resource in a capital sense is, well, it's perverse. It's metaphysical capitalism. And it is maintainers' time that ends up with infinite demand on it in open source software. There's always another bug to fix. There's always another issue to triage. There's always another feature that maybe we could implement. Now that dynamic is in play to some extent with normal infrastructure, but when we build a water system, we pay people to build it and maintain it. And that wasn't true for Log4j in 2021. We didn't. Let's talk a little about the polity of open source. And this might make you think of politics, and that's right, but not in a narrow or partisan sense. Rather, polity is how people work together. It is the root of politics, and not merely in some banal etymological sense, but in the sense that trying to get people to work together for a common end, and at best for a common good, is what politics fundamentally is. But polity also describes things like, hey, does your church have a pope, or does it only have rule by the local congregation? That's polity. The organization of your ultimate frisbee team, that's a polity. It is, as Webster's unabridged 1913, look, I don't like quoting the dictionary in talks, but Webster's unabridged 1913 is great, so I'm going to quote it anyway. Polity is the form or constitution by which any institution is organized, the recognized principles which lie at the foundation of any human institution. Merriam-Webster, take notes. We can write dictionaries like this. Any human institution. Well, open source software is such an institution, though I think we often fail to recognize it as such. And it has a polity. Indeed, it has a polity of many little polities. And it is quite unlike our other polities. There's no central organizing structure to it. We've seen that. There is, as I like to put it, no CEO of open source software. When my friend Ben and I wrote that library a few years ago, no one told us we needed to do it. We just saw an opening in the open source ecosystem for something that we would like to use, and we built it. And if it had been our companies telling us, you need to build this, we probably would have stopped when we left those companies. But instead, still maintaining it. Somebody said, hey, the docs suck a couple months ago, and I was like, they kind of do. So I fixed them. They still need more fixing, but this is open source. And even when we formalize things more, the basic model is kind of show up and do things if you want to. I mean, the Rust Foundation has started hiring project management people because the project of the Rust language is so big that it needs that. But at the end of the day, the model is still show up and do things if you want to. That's even true with corporate contributions to it. So this way of doing things that we've kind of stumbled into, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, to use Eric Raymond's terms, though not necessarily everything else he said about open source, this bazaar, this kind of open market where we're just interacting with each other on our own terms, not a cathedral, not centrally coordinated or built. It is a kind of anarchy. And it represents a kind of anarchism. Now, let's stop and define some terms. Anarchy is a very, very fraught term. Anarchism as a political philosophy is a very, very fraught term, not least because it's had a history from the origins, especially in Europe, of tending toward violence, from the Anabaptists in Munster in the early days of the Protestant Reformation, which gave Baptists a bad name in Europe. Like, the Europeans were like, no Baptists, bad, for 100 years because they got so out of whack in Munster. They settled down, it's okay. Also, like, violent assassinations in the 19th and 20th centuries, property destruction in the 20th and 21st, like, anarchy has a bad name. So let's be careful what we do and don't mean by it. I don't mean those things. Rather, I mean something more like what Anabaptists have come to mean. You talk to an Anabaptist today, they're some of the most pacifistic people in the whole world. Violence is right out. And that's how we should be thinking about this. We should be thinking about this in the sense of anarchy as the word means. Anarchos, no ruler. There's no one in charge of this. I made my library, you made your library, someone else can assemble them in a neat way. Because that's actively constructive, not destructive. And it's constructive in a really glorious way. We benefit from and we build on each other's work. We enjoy and riff on each other's work. Sometimes we challenge each other's work by putting out a competitor, and then we learn from each other, and maybe those come together. Or I think we can't hope to see why open source has worked as well as it has as infrastructure, but also its limitations, if we don't grapple with the fact that it is, in fact, anarchic. That has legal and social and economic implications. And what's more, just keep doing anarchy and it'll be fine is not a great strategy, not least because of how it intersects with the dynamics of power. Many decades ago, Joe Freeman wrote an essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. If you haven't read it, go look it up and read it. She's writing from the context of her involvement in a movement she dearly loved and believed in, the feminist movement. But she saw that that instantiation of that movement was one that was explicitly anti-hierarchical. There will be no one in charge. But social hierarchies still emerged in that context. The problem was you couldn't name them, you couldn't interact with them, they were always deniable. Anti-hierarchical systems, anarchic systems, still have power structures embedded in them. Because that's what we do, we build hierarchies. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to deal with it if we're going to keep them from becoming unhealthy. And this is true of open source projects too. Even when there's no legal contract, even when there's no explicit social contract, those power dynamics still exist. So in the JavaScript ecosystem, we have the React framework for rendering things, and we have the Redux library. And Redux doesn't have to be used with React, but it mostly is. And so the reality is that even though there's no official agreement between those two teams, even though there's no contract between them, even though there's no explicit technical dependency even between them, what React does, Redux has to respond to. And React can, and has, unintentionally usually, they're well-meaning, but React has broken Redux. And Redux has been sitting there feeling, how do we fix this? And going back and talking to them. Even though both of these teams are just trying to do the best thing for their users, there's a power dynamic there. So we can't just say, anarchy, problem solved. Working so far, great. In the same way that we can't just say, markets solve all the problems. Well, no, they solve some problems really well. But they usually need supportive structure around them to make them work well. And what's more, they always, inevitably, instantiate the things we believe and our values. They're not inherently virtuous or vicious. Anarchic systems, market systems, etc. They're human systems, so they can be either. It depends on what we build, and so it depends on what values we stamp them with. Here's Chatra again. Like all technologies, these systems, infrastructural systems, incorporate the values of their builders. Many infrastructural systems, like municipal water supplies, include ideals like serving the public good and universal provision or meeting the basic needs of everyone in a community. But some of the values are far less laudable. The social and environmental costs of high-quality infrastructural systems for one group are often borne by others who are not in that group. So for example, if you build a power plant that supplies lots of electricity but also poisons the air of the people around it, well, not so laudable. On the other hand, if you build a municipal water supply, you might get rid of cholera for everybody. Very laudable. We will, inevitably, encode the things we value in it. And as much as sometimes it could be tempting for the well-off among us, and probably most of us here should count ourselves in that mix, certainly I do, it might be easy to say, well, I wish I could get away with doing this just for me without that impacting my neighbor. I don't want to pay for my neighbor. The reality is that things like public water systems only work if they work for everybody. You only get rid of cholera if the rich guy and the poor guy both get rid of cholera, both get water supplies. More than that utilitarian argument, I think it matters if our values are Nietzschean politics of power, or if they are what Nietzsche demeaningly called a slave morality, that values the least of those among us. If that's what a slave morality is, I'll own it. I'll follow Simone Weil down that path, and I'll own it. Talk to me more about that afterward. I think for open source software to be good infrastructure, we need to own the obligations that entails. If we're building stuff that the whole world runs on, well, then we have obligations to what we build and how. And I think that it works best and is best when we build in the kind of egalitarian and communitarian norms that have astonishingly shaped open source from the beginning. That everyone's welcome. We don't care what your ethnicity is. We don't care what language you speak. We don't care where you're from. Come and contribute. You're welcome. And that has been its mode from the beginning. And also generous from the beginning. Here it is. Take it. Use it for free. And if that's sometimes been its Achilles heel, it's also beautiful. It's freely available. We share it alike. We welcome your contributions. And if for whatever reason we can't take your contribution, we say, that's fine. Fork it. Make it your own. That's not just allowed. It's actively encouraged. Great. How do we do that without crushing the people who maintain it? Log4j. I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I have some ideas and we'll point at them here. But I want you to think of this talk more as a framing for what we're actually doing here and a problem statement for where we go than as a bucket of solutions. If I had solutions, I'd be out there just implementing them. I'm hoping that in giving this talk and reframing a bit, we can all start thinking along these lines and address it better. Because our work in open source software is, well, as I said at the beginning, it's weird. It's a collective creation of infrastructure that is governed anarchically as a whole. It's probably the biggest experiment in anarchic governance, and certainly the biggest experiment in anarchic infrastructure in history. And it works. I keep coming back to that. It works spectacularly well, except for where it runs into things like log4 shell. So we need a way to coordinate a bit more explicitly, to fund a bit more effectively, while not giving up all the good things we have along the way. I'm going to come back to Chatra here for a minute. I quoted her earlier as talking about how infrastructural systems are famously boring. The quote continues, "Nothing happens and nothing continues to happen as a result of sufficient attention, specialized care, and unceasing oversight. Nothing happening is usually the result of careful inspection schedules, preventive maintenance, planned replacement, all of which require resources to be devoted to what will be at best a null outcome." And I think she's right to foreground attention here. Infrastructure neither gets built in the first place, nor continues to work reliably after it is built without attention. And attention is not free. It is specifically attention that we pay when we build open source software and when we maintain open source software. Attention to the needs of its users, attention to the needs of the world it's entering, and so on. Almost a decade ago, in a wonderful essay called Attending to Technology, Theses for Disputation, Alan Jacobs, who I mentioned earlier, wrote, "If instead of thinking of the internet in statist terms, we apply the logic of subsidiarity, we might be able to imagine the digital equivalent of a Mondragon cooperative." He was writing about the pseudo-common that is social media. But I think if we dig into what these terms are and mean, they can give us a pointer toward where we want to go in the sense of open source. Statist. Central state control. Open source doesn't work this way, and it shouldn't work this way. The reason it works so well is that there was no City of Sunnyvale commission saying, please build a competitor to GCC. Log4j didn't need that to come into existence or to continue in existence. That said, there may be a useful intersection between state funding without going statist here. Germany's Sovereign Tech Fund is now a significant ongoing investor in the Log4j infrastructure in response to that 2021 incident. But it's invested money without trying to exert control, without trying to say, you must now stop working in that anarchic way you were working before. So we want to keep that anarchic governance mode without going statist, and we can. Subsidiarity. It's a principle that came out of Catholic social teaching, mostly in response to the Industrial Revolution and how it played out in the 19th and early 20th century. And it says that the most local institution that can handle a problem should. So if a family can handle something in a healthy and safe way, don't get the city government involved. And likewise, if a city can handle something, don't get a national government involved. Now, sometimes we need supranational coordination. We needed that to fix the hole in the ozone layer. And hey, good job, we did that. Really cool. But most things don't require that kind of coordination at that level. Most things can be handled locally. And if they can, they should, because that kind of local act is the least likely to cause incidental harm along the way. It has the most context, and therefore the best idea of how to apply an appropriate solution. Open source does this great. Actually, we have the opposite problem. We push too many things down to the individual or the individual team where sometimes we need to coordinate across more. But let's keep that. The Mondragon Cooperative is a Spanish workers' collective that was built after World War II. It's a business, it's a chain of grocery stores, but it is owned and operated by its employees. And they've hired management to do some tasks, but notice the order there. The employees hired management, not the other way around. And it began as an explicitly Christian anarchy. So it built on an ethos. I talked about the values earlier. It built on an ethos that says, hey, the mentally and physically disabled people in our community matter. Let's find a role for them here. Let's build a company that works for the good of our community that way. And it's imperfect, as all human institutions are, but it does actually do the work. And it has pretty good outcomes. It's less vulnerable to capture by short-term profits and more interested in sustaining the good of its community because it's owned by its community. But open source isn't quite like that. We're going to have to imagine something that's a little different because, well, make a thing, sell the thing works pretty well for a chain of grocery stores. We're not building that kind of thing. We're building infrastructure, and we're trying to coordinate our attention. We're trying to get people and companies and governments to fund our attention and our time. So, what might that look like? The two most promising moves I see in this space are foundations and collectives, which are closely related to each other. Foundations are just nonprofits that try to help the software get built sustainably. Rust or the Zig Foundation, the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation. Their responses to the coordination problem that we talked about earlier. When you have these anarchic contribution models, especially when you have funding coming in, how do you coordinate that? And that especially shows up because people do recognize the free rider problem. Individuals and businesses alike, and now governments too, recognize, hey, this stuff matters. It's infrastructure, and we need to fund it, or it's going to go away, or it's going to get broken. Foundation can help coordinate that and deliver what is needed to those people at the right time. Hire a consultant to solve a particular problem, or fund full-time ongoing work, or whatever it may be. And collectives are sort of a variation on this theme. In general, we only apply foundations to the biggest projects. Collectives are the same idea, but applied at a much wider range of scales. We're going to provide the infrastructure for you to take investments and to disperse them, hopefully transparently. Open Collectives platform, for example, makes it possible for you to take in contributions and see how they're used. And that's really valuable because it gives some sense of integrity to the process. Critically, though, in both of these cases, they modify but don't fundamentally change the anarchic nature of what we're building. Open Collective literally just funds all these little collectives for all these little projects. And even a foundation, like I said earlier, well, Rust has a foundation and it's funding some things, but the model is still show up and do stuff if you want to. So they don't break that, and that's good. They provide a layer on top of organization or as a backstop to handle the things that, look, who signs up to write open source software so they can deal with funding? It's not why we do it generally, but somebody has to. But they also don't solve the problem. Log4j was maintained by the Apache Logging Services team, as in the Apache Foundation. So these are a step in the right direction, but they're just a step. They're a start. We need to iterate on them and build on them. We're going to have to try and probably fail many times, but try to imagine models that provide more of that backstop and more of that structure that we need without giving up what is good in this anarchic way of building infrastructure that somehow remarkably does in fact work. Because I think open source software has something actually really beautiful and wonderful to share with the world here. There's something really profoundly good in the way that we bring people together from, as I said earlier, every ethnicity, every language, every country in the world, to build something good that we couldn't build apart, but that we're also not building with central coordination. We're each doing the work we see is worth doing, and out of that comes something, frankly, much bigger than the sum of its parts, and something remarkable and beautiful and good. So, let's hold on to that, and let's figure out how to make it work as infrastructure in a way that embodies a commitment to everyone's good. Thank you.